The morning sunlight streamed through the half-drawn blinds, illuminating the thick stack of divorce papers sitting on the wooden dining table. My fingers hovered above them, trembling slightly, as though the ink itself carried the weight of betrayal. I never thought my marriage, 15 years of love, laughter, and shared dreams would end like this. His name was David. Charming, confident, the kind of man who could light up a room with his easy smile. I fell for that smile when I was barely 23. Back then, I thought he was my future, my anchor. But over time, I realized he was a storm disguised as calm waters. Sign them, David had said coldly the night before, his tone stripped of affection. It's better this way. You'll get what you need, and I'll finally have peace. What I needed. The gall of that man. He had already moved into a luxury condo downtown, paid for by the same business we had built together, except in the legal paperwork, it was under his name. The restaurants, the real estate deals, the consulting contracts we had worked side by side. Yet the lawyer sitting across from me last week had called me the homemaker, as though my years of managing, organizing, and strategizing from behind the scenes were invisible. The divorce settlement was clear. He got the businesses, the properties, and the reputation. I got a modest monthly allowance and a small townhouse in the suburbs. He thought he won, but he underestimated one thing. Me dot as I stared at the papers, memories flooded my mind. The nights when I stayed up balancing accounts while he schmoozed at bars. The clients I brought in through sheer relationship building. The employees who called me when they had issues because they knew David wouldn't listen. The truth was, I had been the quiet backbone of his empire dot, and now he wanted to erase me with a signature. I picked up the pen but paused. Instead of anger, a small smile tugged at my lips. Let him think he won. Because the final move? That was mine, and it was already in motion. The first step was silence. When you want to destroy a man who believes he's already ahead, you don't argue. You don't scream. You let him bask in the illusion of victory. And David was basking. I saw it in his smugness when he showed up at court with his new girlfriend. A woman barely out of college, dangling on his arm like a trophy. I heard it in his voice when he whispered to his lawyer, smirking at me across the room. But while he gloated, I was watching, listening, preparing. Every empire has cracks, and David's was full of them. Employees he underpaid. Partners he double-crossed. Taxes he forgot to declare. I knew every weak spot because I had been there for all of it. For weeks, while he celebrated his so-called freedom, I quietly pulled strings. I met with accountants who owed me favors, whispered to ex-employees still loyal to me, and even reached out to a journalist who had once asked for an inside scoop on David's business. Piece by piece, I gathered evidence. Not fabricated lies, not petty rumors, but the truth. Truth so sharp it could cut his empire at its core. One evening, sitting in my dimly lit living room, I opened a leather folder filled with bank statements, tax discrepancies, and hidden contracts signed under false pretenses. My hands didn't shake anymore. My smile wasn't bitter. It was calm, certain that David thought the divorce was the end of my story. He didn't realize it was just the prologue. The storm was coming. And when it hit, he wouldn't just lose me. He'd lose the very empire he thought defined him. The city never really sleeps. Neon lights flicker, car horns echo, and somewhere in the chaos, secrets are traded like currency. I found myself in a quiet booth of an old cafe on the east side, a place where the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Across from me sat Anna, one of David's former assistants. Her hands curled around a chipped mug, her eyes darting nervously to the door every few minutes. You didn't hear this from me, she whispered, sliding a small flash drive across the table. But you were the only one who ever treated us like people, not tools. I picked it up, slipping it into my bag without a word. My heart was pounding, but my face remained calm. What's on it? I asked softly. Records? Anna replied. Emails, contracts, things he thought no one noticed. But I kept copies. For insurance. The man thinks he's untouchable. He isn't. I leaned back, watching her. There was fear in her eyes, but also relief. David had left more than broken hearts in his wake. He left behind people he underestimated, people like Anna who were tired of being invisible. Later that night, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. Line after line of damning evidence glowed on the screen. Unpaid invoices, shady transfers to offshore accounts, a pattern of exploiting loopholes while pretending to be a respectable businessman. I stared at the screen until the glow blurred my vision. This was it, the leverage I needed, but something stirred inside me. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Not just for me, but for everyone David had trampled on in his pursuit of power. My phone buzzed. A message from David. Sign the papers yet? Don't drag this out longer than necessary. I almost laughed. He still thought I was helpless. He had no idea that his empire was already cracking brick by brick, and I was the one pulling them apart. The gala was David's playground. He loved the spotlight, the cameras flashing, the endless clinking of champagne glasses. It was the perfect stage for him to flaunt his new life, and it was the perfect stage for me to begin his downfall. I arrived in a sleek black dress, my hair pulled back, my smile calm but unreadable. The room buzzed with energy investors, politicians, old money, and socialites all mingling under crystal chandeliers. And then there he was, David, laughing too loudly, holding his girlfriend by the waist like she was the crown jewel of his kingdom. Our eyes met across the room. His smirk widened. Didn't expect to see you here, he said as I approached, his voice dripping with arrogance. Why wouldn't I be here? I replied smoothly. After all, I helped build this empire you're parading around. His jaw tightened. But before he could respond, I turned and greeted an investor standing nearby, a man I knew well, one who had always trusted my judgment more than David's flashy promises. Throughout the night, I moved through the crowd with precision. Every conversation, every smile, every subtle remark was part of my plan. I dropped hints, small, careful seeds of doubt about David's business practices. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant, I simply suggested. Investors hate instability, and I was giving them just enough to start questioning Dot. By the end of the night, I saw it the way people looked at David. A little less admiration, a little more suspicion. He didn't notice it yet, but the shift had begun. When I slipped into my car later, the city lights glowing in the rearview mirror, I finally allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. David thought he won the divorce. But what he didn't realize was that I was rewriting the story, not as the abandoned wife, but as the woman who would dismantle his empire piece by piece. And the Scala? It was only the opening move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. David always believed perception was reality. If people saw him as powerful, then he was powerful. But power built on lies is like glass. It shines until the cracks appear, and I was the one holding the hammer. A week after the gala, I received a call from an old friend in the financial press. Julia and I had once bonded over late nights and cheap takeout when she was still clawing her way into journalism. Now she was one of the most respected reporters in the city. I heard whispers about David, she said carefully. Offshore accounts, shady transfers. I can't publish without proof. But if there's something out there, I paused. My hand hovered over my laptop, where Anna's flash drive still sat like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. There might be, I said softly. But if I give it to you, Julia, you need to promise me one thing. You don't hold back, she exhaled. You know, I don't. When the article hit, it wasn't a nuclear bomb, it was something worse. A slow, Spreading fire. Respected businessman David Whitmore. Linked to questionable financial transfers, the headline read. The piece was meticulous, sourced careful enough to avoid lawsuits, but sharp enough to draw blood. Investors panicked. Partners started calling. David tried to brush it off as baseless speculation that doubt had been planted, and doubt was poison in his world. I watched the fallout from the quiet of my apartment. It wasn't joy I felt, it was something colder, sharper. That night, David showed up at my door. No flowers, no apologies, just rage. You did this, he snarled, his fists clenched. Don't play dumb. You've been whispering in ears, feeding lies. Do you think you can destroy me? I leaned against the doorway, my expression calm. I don't need to destroy you, David. You're doing that all by yourself. His face twisted, but he couldn't say more. Not without admitting how much truth Julia had uncovered. He stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the hall like thunder fading into the night. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The cracks in his mirror were spreading Dot by the time the second article dropped, this one linking David to unpaid taxes and questionable partnerships. He was already bleeding. But to finish him, I needed more than whispers and doubt. I needed all eyes. That's when Mark entered the picture. He was once David's closest business partner, a man who had built entire projects alongside him before being unceremoniously cut out when David no longer needed him. We met at a dimly lit bar downtown, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Mark was older, sharper, with eyes that carried the bitterness of betrayal. So, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, you want to take him down? I don't want revenge for revenge's sake, I replied. I want justice. And I think you do too, he smirked. Justice is just a polite word for revenge. But yes, I want it. Over the next hour, Mark laid out stories, files, even names of people David had stepped on, manipulated, ruined. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle, and together, it painted a picture of a man who wasn't just corrupt. He was ruthless. I felt a chill run through me. For years, I had lived in the shadow of this man, convincing myself that maybe I was exaggerating his cruelty. But hearing it confirmed by someone else, seeing the evidence, it solidified everything. David wasn't just my enemy. He was everyone's. With Mark's help, I compiled a dossier that would shatter the last of his defenses. Emails, contracts, testimonies. Not just financial fraud, but personal betrayals that could ruin his reputation permanently. But I knew David wouldn't go down without a fight. The man was a master manipulator. He'd twist, he'd threaten, he'd charm. He'd do anything to survive Dot, and yet, as I stared at the growing mountain of evidence on my dining table, I realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore, Dot. It was about winning. David thought he'd already won the divorce. But this wasn't about a marriage ending. It was about an empire falling, and I was the one bringing it down. The first real collapse came in the form of silence. David's phone had always been a symphony of constant pings, emails, calls, messages. He thrived on that noise, the endless stream of validation and deals. But suddenly, the noise was gone. Investors withdrew. Partners pulled out. The silence was louder than any explosion. Dot. It was during a shareholder meeting that the first public crack turned into a full fracture. Mark had tipped me off to attend discreetly. I sat in the back, hidden among the audience, while David stood at the podium, his polished smile faltering as questions rained down. What about the offshore accounts, David? Why didn't you disclose these tax liabilities? Is it true your contracts with Brent and Steele were falsified? David's voice, once commanding, now trembled beneath the weight of scrutiny. He stammered, deflected, tried to charm. The charm doesn't work when money's on the line. I watched him, not with glee, but with a cold satisfaction. This wasn't a man in control anymore. This was a man drowning in the very ocean he thought he commanded. After the meeting, he spotted me in the crowd. For a moment, his eyes locked onto mine, burning with fury, desperation, fear. He didn't approach. He couldn't. Not here, not now. But that look, it told me he knew. That night, I received a message from an unknown number. Meet me tomorrow, 9 p.m. You know where. The address was an old warehouse near the docks, a place David once used for private negotiations. I hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan, but something in me, curiosity, defiance, pulled me there. The warehouse smelled of rust and old oil. Shadows stretched across the floor. And there he was, David, no tailored suit this time. Just a man stripped of polish, eyes bloodshot, his confidence cracked. You think this makes you strong? He said, stepping closer. You think tearing me down gives you power? I didn't flinch. No, David, power isn't something you take from someone. It's something you build yourself. And you've built nothing but lies. For the first time, his face softened, not with remorse, but with realization. He saw it now. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The following weeks were a blur of headlines, lawsuits, and whispered conversations in corridors of power. David's empire wasn't just trembling, it was collapsing. But this was where most people would stop. This was where they'd say, enough. He's ruined. Not me, because David hadn't just hurt me financially. He had humiliated me in court, stripped me of dignity, painted me as the villain in a story I didn't write. That stain wouldn't fade just because his company was failing, so I set my final move in motion, with Mark's connections and Julia's pen. I pieced together a public narrative, not just of fraud, but of betrayal. Stories of employees he had underpaid, families he had left in ruins, partners he had discarded. It wasn't just about numbers anymore, it was about people. And people talked. A televised interview was arranged. Not for me, but for Anna, the quiet accountant whose evidence had started all of this. Watching her sit under the studio lights, her voice shaking as she described the years of falsifying records under David's pressure, was like watching a truth too heavy to ignore finally see daylight. By the next morning, David was no longer just a businessman in trouble. He was a criminal under investigation. Police raided his offices. Boxes of documents were carried out under flashing cameras. His face, once a symbol of power, was now plastered across every channel as a man accused of corruption, fraud, and betrayal. But the true victory came quietly. In a sealed envelope delivered to my door. It was a letter from David. The handwriting was messy, rushed. You win? Are you happy now? You've taken everything. Everything I built. Everything I was. What do you have left? Does it feel good? I stared at the words for a long time. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race because this wasn't about feeling good. It was about reclaiming the truth. David thought he had won the divorce. But in reality, the divorce was only the beginning. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension. Reporters filled the benches, their pens scratching furiously, eyes shifting between David and me. For years, he had walked into rooms like this with arrogance stitched into his skin. Today he was smaller. His suit hung loose. His once proud posture slouched. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision. Forged contracts, hidden accounts, tax fraud. Each word was a hammer pounding against David's carefully built facade. And then it was my turn to take the stand. I hadn't planned on speaking, but when the prosecutor asked if I'd testify, I agreed. Not for revenge, this wasn't about gloating. It was about reclaiming my voice. I looked at the judge, then at the crowd, then finally at David, this man. I began, my voice steady. Didn't just cheat the system. He cheated everyone who ever trusted him. He cheated employees, partners, even me. He turned lies into weapons and used them to destroy lives. David's jaw tightened. His eyes burned into mine. But lies have a way of unraveling, I continued. And the truth is louder than all his manipulation combined. There was silence, heavy, unshakable. When the verdict was read, it wasn't just numbers and charges. It was years in prison. It was restitution. It was the law finally catching up with the man who thought he was untouchable. David's head dropped into his hands. For the first time in years, I saw him as he really was, not a powerful man. Not a monster, but a broken human being trapped in the web he had spun. And me. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, walked out, and felt the weight of chains I hadn't realized I was carrying finally fall away. Months later, the world looked different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. A new home. A new business. New people who didn't look at me with pity, but with respect. Julia. And I started a small firm together specializing in helping women who'd been silenced in court, just like I once was. Anna became our first client, then our partner. Mark visited often, his easy grin reminding me that not all men use power to destroy. As for David, he was a headline, a cautionary tale, a name whispered with disdain in boardrooms. The empire he had fought to protect was ashes one evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on my balcony, the city lights blinking awake beneath me. A glass of wine in my hand, the breeze brushing against my skin, and I smiled. Not because I had won. Winning wasn't the point. I smiled because I had survived. Because I had refused to be silenced. Because I had turned pain into strength, betrayal into fire. David thought he had won the divorce, but in the end, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. Finally free, finally whole, finally unbroken. I raised the glass, whispered softly into the night, to truth, to freedom, to never being afraid again. And for the first time in years, my heart felt light.